you. Thanks so much, Emma. Thank you all for being here at this early hour of the morning. This is such a lovely way to start the day, and to be here at Commune and to meet so many of you. It's great. Am I standing in a good place here, or should I move? Is that okay?
You're good.
Excellent. Yeah, so depth. I'm a writer based in Sheffield. I sort of dabble in all kinds of different forms of writing, from poetry to non-fiction. I'm quite restless. I like to learn things from new forms. I like to discover what's different about the process of writing a novel from a book of poems or a short story, and what you can sort of cross-pollinate from one genre to the others. But poetry is my first love. It's the form that I always come back to. It's where some of my sort of most urgent ideas seem to want to take root. So the theme of depth made me think about poetry in particular. And it made me think, I've just published a collection, handily enough, which connected for me anyway to the theme, because it's sort of loosely themed around body modification of different kinds, and especially in relation to female bodies. It's called The Illustrated Woman. So of course depth was making me think about the idea of things that are skin deep, and what I was like, what does that mean? That actually your skin has loads of layers, and all those kind of ways that we might use phrases about depth and the skin and about illustration. So I'm sort of going to tangentially talk to you about this theme of poetry and permanence, and the idea of what permanence means, and whether we find it terrifying or liberating. Anyone who's it's Sheffield Tattoo Festival this weekend, which is like the first tattoo festival they've had in Sheffield, so I thought it was a nice way to signpost that as well by talking about that theme today. And one of the first things that people sometimes ask if you've got a lot of tattoos is, but it's there forever. What are you going to think about it when you're... Someone told me that their friend had said to them, what are you going to think when you're 80 wearing a bikini? To which my response was, I think I'd be delighted if I was in my bikini at 80 with my tattoos. It sounds great. But yeah, this idea of what's permanent. But actually, one of the themes I'm going to talk to you a bit about today is the status of the tattoo as art, and whether we can consider it to be a work of art, or whether it's lack of permanence because it lasts as long as the human skin that's got it designed on them, whether it is really permanent, and if it is that kind of terrifying thing, and also the connections to writing. So this is going to make me feel really powerful for a second. Next slide, please. Don't forget to do this before. So when I was thinking about this idea of ink, I started thinking about what's special about poetry compared to other forms of art and other forms of expression. Of course, poets like to think they're very special. We always love talking about the uniqueness of poetry. But no poets ever seem to be able to agree on a sensible, consistent definition of what makes a poem. Does it have to rhyme? Does it not rhyme? Should it be arranged in a particular form? Or does it matter? Was a prose poem a poem? When does a piece of writing become a poem? But one thing that consistently comes up is its relationship to space, and the idea that the poem uses more blank space on the page than maybe other forms, and that's how we know one when we see one. And I'm really interested in that. I think writing a poem is quite an audacious thing to do, because you're saying, look, here it is, it's in the middle of the page, it's taking up that much space, but it's also working with blank space. And so I went back to Keats, who believed that a poem has to strive for the infinite, that poems want to be permanent in some way. They want you to remember them, they want you to carry them around with you forever and ever and repeat them. Who knows a poem by heart? Has anyone here got anything? Don't worry, I'm not going to make you recite it. Has anyone got a poem that they've known all their lives that's memorised in their head? Or maybe your grandma or your mum or your dad or someone had that? Few hands up, yeah. There's something quite special, I think, about being able to memorise something and then carry it with you without needing to even have it on the page. So I can see the poems inspired to this kind permanence. But Keats also thought that poetry made life permanent because it fixes a moment, or it captures an incident. Again, poems get compared to millions of different things. I've heard them compared to photos before, and that's in that idea, I think, of fixing a particular moment and holding it as it is. Next slide, please. So this book, The Illustrated Woman, I think if it's about anything, it's about this paradox. This is a writer called Antonio Porcia, who's an aphorist. So he comes up with really memorable truisms about life. I'd love to be wise enough to be an aphorist, and everything you said would be really profound. But he was talking about writing and what the writer does. And he said, I know what I have given you, I do not know what you have received. And I think there's something interesting there, of course, about art and about the gap and the interesting alchemy that takes place between artist and audience, but also about the ways we might be projecting ourselves into the world, whether it's about how we choose to present ourselves. Some things are not a choice, but the difference between how we think we're going to be seen or might want to be seen and how we are seen by other people, and that's the kind of tension that's at the heart of this book. Next slide, please. I could get used to this. So I'll read you a poem actually to start things off, to give you a flavour of some of the themes that come into this collection. This is a piece called The Illustrated Woman. There's a famous story by Ray Bradbury called The Illustrated Man, and this title was meant to be a kind of riffing off that. Are the different, particularly I was interested in all the different kind of ways that we view heavily illustrated men and women, or the more taboos for women, for instance, in how they're presenting. The Illustrated Woman. An inventory of the subject's skin found that she was completely covered, not as a map covers the terrain, but as a river covers its stones. Yes, even the insides of her ears, even her labia, even the ridges of her back teeth. We know this to be impossible. It is as if she wanted to leave no room for anything to touch her. She was not tall, nor was she broad across the shoulders. Her mouth may have been small, but singling out her facial features was difficult, such was the density of the ink that joined them. You might say she designed herself. Amongst the most impressive was a horse standing on its hind legs, rearing on her back, nostrils steaming. When he first examined her, the coroner reports he heard a noise, as if a great tree had fallen, a crash, and then a quickening, something not unlike the thunder of hooves. So I think that idea of designing yourself, the idea of designing the self, is something that I'm very interested in as a metaphor, not specifically about tattooing. And as I say, the gap between how you try to design yourself and how others will try to design you, which is something I've written about in relation to image manipulation and things like that as well, and how we might reclaim agency. So to illustrate the other side of it, I'm going to read you another poem, which is what's called a found poem. I don't know if anyone's come across found poetry before. It's basically, it means the words in this piece are not mine, only the arrangement of the words is mine. They've been taken from another source and then rearranged. So the words come from an article that I found online from Psychology Today called What People Really Think About Women with Tattoos. And I love those articles, those what people really think about articles, because as soon as you read that what people really think about, you sort of know that the outcome isn't going to be particularly subtle or nuanced or reflective. So I was very interested in this. I always turn to Google first when I'm researching a new topic, which might sound very intellectual to go there first, but I'm really fascinated by what it tells us about our culture and about expectations and predictions. So like when you type in something and it suggests what you might be looking for, those are the kind of things that I'm fascinated by. What does it think that I'm going to say if I've typed in this phrase? So this was one of the first things that came up when I was looking for women with tattoos. So the words, as I say, are not mine. I've just put them into a shape and repeated things. It's called A Well-Known Beach. This study examined the approach behaviour of men to women lying on a well-known beach. The women were reading, well-known, lying flat on their stomachs, some with a tattoo prominently displayed on their lower backs. On a well-known beach, women were reading, flat on their well-known stomachs, some with a tattoo on their lower backs, some without. On a well-known beach, men were more likely to approach the women with visible tattoos, not because they found them to be more attractive, but because the women, well-known, reading on their lower backs, because they believed the tattooed women, the men well-known, the women lying on their flat stomachs, but because they believed the tattooed women would be more likely to have sex, well-known, prominently displayed on their lower backs, more likely to have sex on the first date than their clear-skinned counterparts. With all these articles, I'm fascinated by the representations and the simplifications about what people do. I don't for a minute really believe that this poem isn't in any way supposed to be a generalisation about men. I don't really believe that anybody does that, but it's really interesting that that there are so many psychological case studies that try to illustrate this gap between how we present ourselves and how other people might see the same thing. Next slide, please. I will have forgotten what's on some of these slides, so it's a great surprise to me as much as to you. So yeah, I got really interested in the concept and the history in this collection of the tattooed lady, which has its kind of origins in the circus and in the idea of performance in itself. So in Victorian times, in the UK, it was said that in that era, one of the only professions where a working class woman could earn as much as or more than her male equivalent in the same profession was as a tattooed lady in the circus. And this, of course, was because at that time, the spectacle of the tattooed woman was considered to be more shocking and therefore more lucrative. And in America, there were all kinds of shocking stories that I found about the way that these circus performers were billed, the way they were treated. So for instance, they were expected to go into the arena in their bikini, but then in the street they were still looked on as a bit shameful because of their body art, so they had to cover up. And they'd usually say every time they brought out one of the performers, this is her first time showing her bizarre skin in front of people in public, and it wasn't. She'd done that every night that week for a different audience. So this myth of purity somehow, or of kind of secrecy. The other myth that I found really disturbing was that quite a lot of stories around American tattooed ladies, tattooed women, there were usually stories they were supposed to tell about how they'd got the tattoos, and it usually involved they meant to say they'd been kidnapped by indigenous peoples, by First Nations Americans, and forcibly tattooed, like held down and tattooed. And of course, that wasn't what had happened. It was usually somebody's partner or brother, or they'd decide, or they'd got the tattoos of their own free will. And there's some shocking stories that I read about people having to co-opt a narrative that wasn't true at all and wasn't their own. So those are the kind of stories that fed into this book, and I like doing that kind of research, and I'm really interested in what it tells us about changing societal norms and stuff like that. So could I have the next slide, please? But yeah, so I think one of the reasons I like to think that I'm so interested in tattooing myself, apart from personal reasons and specifically to do with controlling my own image and how I'm seen, having, like many people, had experiences of my image being used in ways I don't want it to be. It feels like a kind of reclaiming of something. But not just that, I think I'm really interested in tattooing and wrote this book because I think a tattoo is a bit like a poem. Here I go again, I'm adding to the tradition of poets trying to define poetry just by saying, well, it's a bit like this and it's also a bit like this. But bear with me because I do think there's some similarities. I'm going to try and unpick those a little bit. This is one of the first poems that I read that mentions tattooing. It's by an Irish-American author who's now deceased, Michael Donaghy, and it's called Liverpool. And it starts with this line that I love so much that I've now got it tattooed on my leg. Ever been tattooed? It takes a whim of iron. And I love that phrase, a whim of iron, because it evokes something that's both spontaneous but that also requires a lot of determination. So it's both extremely thought through and not that thought through at all. And I really like that because I think poems are very good at, one of the things that I love about poetry is that a poem can hold a paradox. It can have two things. You don't have to make a narrative, a consistent argument. You can juxtapose different things. You can say, this is true, but this is also true. And have you thought about these two things in relation to each other as well? There's also a bit of a joke in this poem, which always amuses me, about the difference between where and whereabouts. The speaker meets a woman called Tracy, who's got a tattoo, and in stanza 3, he says, like Tracy who confessed she had us done one legless weekend with her ex, heart, arrow, even the bastard's initials, RJL, somewhere where it hurt, she said, and when I asked her where, snapped Liverpool. So the difference between where and where I think is fascinating. But yeah, there's lots of themes here about tattoos as milestones and marking particular key moments in your life, which I think a poem can do too. We often reach for poems at times of change. We know poems get read at weddings, at funerals. They're kind of markers maybe of milestones in parts of our lives. Next slide, please. So I thought that contradiction might that whim of iron might be sort of inherent to both poetry and tattooing. They both often get defined in terms of their medium, whether it's skin or the page. They're both kinds of mark making in a way, and they both raise questions about brevity, permanence, and the passage of time. Next slide, please. This is another poem about tattooing by an author called Mark Doty, who writes a lot about the body. And he's got this piece called 14th Street Gym, which he describes as his ars poetica. And an ars poetica is like a statement of intent. It's what you believe poetry or even literature or art should do. So it's like, this is what it's about. And I was really interested that here he's chosen the theme of the tattoo, the motif of a tattoo, to stand in for what he believes art can do at its best. And the line in this poem that I always come back to is the first line. Beauty that does not disguise the wound, but reads through to the lack it marks. I find that such an interesting statement about our ideals of beauty and aesthetic beauty, in whether it's visual or whether it's to do with what art does. That what is beautiful should contain what is difficult and what we might have overcome or what we might have been told is not beautiful, this idea of the wound. I really recommend Mark Doty in all of his work. He's a fantastic poet. Keeping my eye on the time to make sure that I'm not getting carried away, because I could literally talk about these themes all day and none of you would want that. Next slide please, I think. So there's quite a bit of philosophy of aesthetics, I hope I've got that right, a specific sort of sub-genre of philosophy that looks at this big question, are tattoos art? Should we consider them to be art? I mean, my instinctive response is like, of course, but there are lots of questions that go along with that. So a writer called Eva Dadles has looked at this quite a lot. And she kind of says, well, the tattoos have an interesting artistic position, really, because they raise questions about what we mean by art and what we mean by the self and by collaboration, which are all things that I think are really interesting to pick up on. So she says the tattoo is a two-dimensional design rendered on the surface of a three-dimensional object, the primary function of which involves something other than arousing aesthetic appreciation. So that's interesting. She's sort of acknowledging that we don't just perhaps have tattoos because of what they might look like. That's an element of it, but it might have a particular spiritual meaning, or like I say, it might be a marker of a life event, or all those kinds of things. So she sort of says, well, okay, it's a three-dimensional object, 2D design. That's a bit like if you paint a vase, or you're painting a sculpture or something like that. But it's also different because, she's quoting someone else here, when we look at a tattoo, we see a work of art that is slowly disintegrating with the person upon whom it is placed. And because of that mortal disintegration as an art form, tattoos are in a special position to make us think deeply about art, performance, and our own mortality. So it is frighteningly permanent, but only if you think of the lifespan of a human being as a big deal. Maybe in the context of the whole history of the world and the passage of time, it's actually quite a small time that this work of art exists for. But yeah, her work is really interesting on whether the tattoo is a work of art. And the collaboration thing, which she talks about at great length, is fascinating, because it goes back to this thing again, the Antonio Porcia thing of, I know what I've given you, I do not know what you've received. Usually, not always, but I think unless it's a flash design that you're picking and having put on your body exactly as the artist designed it, quite often tattooing is a collaboration between the person and the artist in terms of ideas. You might talk things through, you might bring elements in and suggest it to them, they might then incorporate them. But even if at its most basic level, even if you did pick a pre-drawn flash design, it's kind of a collaboration because it's your body and they're working with your skin, and they're placing it according to all sorts of things, and there's a reaction going on there. Which makes me think, of course, about what we're doing when any of us are making a work of art. When I'm writing a poem, am I really solitary, or am I in dialogue with an audience, an invisible audience first, and then a real life audience if I'm lucky enough to get it published? And I think we think of writers as very solitary people working in an isolated way, but a lot of the most rewarding stuff in your work comes from sharing it, or it comes from the things that people feed into it, the things that you take from your experience and from the world that you turn into the poem, and then what other people might tell you in response to it, because a piece of writing might mean something entirely different to different people, just as the symbolism of a tattoo might mean something completely different to lots of different people. Next slide, please. So yeah, and I think some of these debates around the permanence of the tattoo have a bit of an echo in these debates about poetry as art. Don Patterson, a Scottish poet who writes a lot about what a poem is, has this idea that a poem is a little machine for remembering itself. He sees poems as these little things that are like memes or something. They want us to remember them. They want us to carry them around. And early poems, the oral tradition in reciting poems, that it's believed that there might have been a sort of memorability function there, that they might have been used to pass on stories and keep them alive in a way that was easier for people to remember because of strategies like rhyme and rhythm and music, which might make it easier to carry around. And the word poetry comes from poesis in Greek, which in turn comes from a term for making. So like tattooing, poetry implicates the body and process, and questions about what makes it distinctive as an art form raise similar challenges to when we talk about tattoos as art. There are similar kind of, well, it doesn't quite fit into that category or that category, which I think is really interesting. Next slide, please. This is another writer, Glyn Maxwell, on poetry. He says that poets work with two materials. One's the black ink and one's the white page. Just don't make the mistake, he says, of thinking that the sheet, that the paper is nothing. For a poet, it's half of everything. If you don't know how to use it, you're writing prose. So he's there, like, defining poetry in terms of the blank page. And it's kind of really interesting if you think back to what Eva Dadlos is saying about the tattoo and the canvas of the human body, the living page, if you like, of human skin. So a tattoo is defined by its relationship with the body in the same way that a poem is defined by its relationship with the page and with silence. A great poet called Ocean Vuong, whose books I really love, once said that, he said, for me, the air is a second page. So it's not just about how it looks on the paper, it's about the pauses that you leave when you're performing a poem and what people might read into those pauses. Next slide, please. Again, Don Patterson, this is just more Don Patterson talking about what poem is. A poem makes a fetish of its memorability. And he talks about what I was saying earlier about it being carried in your head and being portable. We merely recall a string or text or a film or a painting. Actually, at a neurological level, we're only remembering a memory of it, a memory of encountering it. But our memory of the poem is the poem. That's if you memorise it, of course. A poet exploits this fact and tries to burn their poems into your mind and mess with your perception. That makes poets sound really manipulative and a bit weird. But that language, again, it makes me think of tattooing. That stuff like, it tries to burn their poems into your mind, this idea of the permanence, like something being indelibly in your skin, and to change your perception. I think that's really interesting. And yeah, if 100 people were to pick the same image and all corresponding tattoos were done the same, there would still be 100 unique tattoos because it's an interaction between the designer and the person. The imagery can be replicated, but as DNA is unique, the tattoo is effectively non-reproducible. Same with words. You'll remember things with a slightly different emphasis in your own voice, maybe, or you'll single out an image that's important to you. Next slide, please. So I'm really galloping through these. There's so much that I want to say about it. So I think, thinking about my own motivations for writing this book, because I always challenge why I'm so obsessed with something. And I was sure it was more than me just being a bit self-indulgent and going, I love tattooing, I love tattoos, I want to write about it. Although that's a good enough reason to write about anything, quite frankly. But it was that. But it's also, I just thought it's a really interesting metaphor. And if we examine it, it tells us a lot about how we, these things about how we view people, about the idea of permanence and time and passage of time. It also in the book, it enabled me to explore some other themes that I've long been interested in, landscapes as bodies and the landscape of the body. I like writing about the Peak District a lot and the connections between landscapes and people, perceptions of women, adventure, storytelling, all those things came into it because of course every tattoo tells a story, so there's an infinite scope for exploring that. Next slide, please, I think. I'll touch on this very briefly. I'm always interested in those themes and the idea of wildness and the different ways that we try and access wildness. So I've just been writing a memoir which is about becoming a mum for the first time, and sort of how you find wildness in the aftermath of that. And it's interesting, after my son was born, one of the things that I found that I wanted to do more was be tattooed, and I think that's something to do with the body and autonomy and the aftermath of difficult or traumatic experiences, I guess. So next slide, please. Again, and it made me think about questions, and I don't think this just applies to women. I've been focusing on that because that was my position in the book. I was writing as a woman. But this idea of the gaze and how we're looked at, how we're stared at by other people, I think applies much more widely. But I went back to John Berger and his book Ways of Seeing, about the history of art and the history in particular of nudes and drawings of bodies. And he has this idea in the book, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It kind of comes out all the time in modern life, that we're all watching ourselves. We particularly talked about it in relation to women, and he says a woman must continually watch herself. She's almost continually accompanied by her own image of herself, and so she comes to consider the surveyor and the surveyed within her as the two constituent yet always distinct elements of her identity. As I say, maybe most of us, or any of us who use Instagram and things like that, will be familiar with this idea of the image of the self and how we might look from the outside becoming quite an important part of our minds in some way. Next slide, please. I'm just going to touch on this very, very briefly, because it's a whole other book and a whole other story. But in my memoir, I look at a Derbyshire climber who lived until 1995 when she died on K2, having already climbed Everest unsupported successfully. A woman called Alison Hargreaves, who was scrutinised a lot in the media because she was a mother who climbed. And I was really interested in how she felt most at home in her body when she was in the hills, when she was out in wild places, and how she was very, very kind of at one there. And the different ways that we try to, I think, close that gap between the self, the person, the body that we feel we are, and the ways, the image of the self, the other projection, and that stuff that John Berger talks about. For her it was mountains. For some people, including for me at times, it's been tattooing. It's been actively designing bits of my body, and it could mean lots of different things to different people. But it's sort of about how society doesn't always let you merge those things, or isn't comfortable with letting you do that. That book is on the bookstall if anyone is interested in those themes, if anyone's a climber and they want to read about my terrible climbing, amateurish attempts to climb. Next slide, please. And this is nearly the end, I think. Oh yeah, I'm going to finish with a poem. That's what I thought I'd do, and then that really will be it. And if there's questions, then very happy to answer them. So this thing of permanence again, which actually I haven't talked about as much as I thought I would. But I'm really interested in how people respond to that idea. Are we scared of it, or are we inspired by it? Like, one of my favourite things about tattooing is the fact that it feels permanent for me, that it's something that I'm going to carry with me forever, that will change as I change. My partner finds that idea horrific. He's like, how could you possibly know? How could you like something enough that you want to? I mean, if you publish books, maybe you're less worried about that, because of course, if you put something into the world, that poem is going to live somewhere forever, and someone can come back and read it in 20 years and go, what's she talking about? I don't know what she's on about. But I would never seek to, or would never be embarrassed about my really old 20-year-old tattoos any more than I would about my first published poems. I think they're a record of a particular point of life, and they're out in the world, and they're as much for readers as they are for me. But this is just a poem that riffs on that idea of permanence, and it's about wild swimming as well, for anybody who likes that kind of thing and would normally be up at this time in the morning just in freezing cold water. On permanence. My friend says tattoos hide the natural beauty of the naked form. We are swimming at the mill ponds. He steps into cold water and his skin dissolves. My friend has seen me naked 3 times. We do not speak of it, whether he found me beautiful in the morning. Pure skin, he says, pure design. Around him, the water is gorgeous with stirred up mud, silt hanging in slow clouds. On the bank, I stare down at my legs. I love how the peonies on my right hip include the petal of my deepest glassy scar, how the moles that might kill me are stamens on flowers, how cellulite gives texture to sketched gritstone, and the swifts on my chest are the heart in clumsy motion. I do not think I long to be natural, pure like the floors of airports, like a blank expression, the aftermath of the avalanche that buried your body whole. Each night in the bath, my 2-year-old tries to colour me with his pastel crayons, finishing Mummy's pictures. He can't leave a page untouched, paints with his fists and feet, pencils the walls. In water, we are all work in progress, disturbing the surface of the green pond. It is always difficult to start. The stones unbalance me, I fall to my knees like a veteran, survivor of wars of my body's own making. Colposcopy, biopsy, sertraline and stitched tears. Let me stay here for a moment. Let me kneel before the sky and let me be humble, untidy. Let me be decorated. Next slide, please. End slide. So I am going to wrap up there, but one idea that we've not talked about that I just wanted to plant sort of very, very quickly is another interesting similarity I find between publishing books of poems and tattooing is what I call the look at me, don't look at me paradox. So I think people assume that if you've got bold tattoos, you've got visible tattoos, then you're kind of saying, look at me. It must be a kind of thing for attention, and why would you, if someone then commented on it, why would you, that you're asking for that? And I think it's a bit more complicated than that, because a lot of people that I know that have tattoos have kind of got them because they're not exactly saying, look at me, they're saying, I'm kind of, maybe they're hiding behind something sometimes, or they want to change the way that they're being looked at by other people, or it's like, look at the tattoos, don't look at me, which I definitely identify with. And of course there's millions of reasons for that, but it's not as simple as, oh, look at me. And it's the same with writing. Again, you would think if you publish something very personal, or very, what Sharon Olds calls apparently personal, because she always says, how do we know? How do we know what's true and what's a fiction? Then it's because you're very comfortable with that. But most of the writers that I know get quite nervous about sharing their work. They kind of want people to read the work without scrutinising them as a person too closely. And we all have these experiences of like what happens when you meet an artist and they're a bit disappointing, and like, oh, they're nothing like the art at all. It's like it's a different part of them, it's a better part of them that they are willing to sort of show to the world. So I think there's a really interesting overlap there in terms of both wanting and hiding from attention that the tattoo and poem have in common. And that's all I've got to say about it, really. I've put some Twittery things and stuff. I've got a website, it hasn't been updated in a very long time though, so I doubt you'll find much useful there, apart from some lovely pictures that Emma Ledwith, who's an amazing photographer, portrait photographer, lives in Sheffield and has done. But yeah, I think that's all. I hope I've not overrun too much. I definitely got carried away, sorry.